Hello there, and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for another volume of Drafting Dangerous. And today I'll be demonstrating a few more fluttery or flouncy sleeve styles that I have received a few requests about over the years. And while this genre of sleeve style tends to lean a bit more fantastical, luckily the modifications themselves are extremely straightforward. So let's go ahead and dive on in. And this mid-century housecoat pattern I found floating over on Pinterest luckily shows both of the most common flared sleeve styles. The flutter sleeve on the left here, and then the bell sleeve on the right. And yes, these are extremely similar. I would say that all flutter sleeves are kind of also bell sleeves. Really the only difference is length. From elbow length and shorter, they're usually called flutter sleeves. Elbow length or longer, they're usually called bell sleeves. And while flutter sleeves can be seen in garments throughout the 20th century, they were especially common in the 1920s and 30s. These are 30s examples here. And then the last example on the right is actually from the 1970s. 1930s styles in general received a huge revival in the 1970s, so you often see repeated motifs in those two decades. And I will be beginning with my basic sleeve block for all four of my demonstrations today. I'm just going to trace the upper half of this because I don't need the whole thing to create a flutter sleeve, and you can always use your elbow dart as sort of a reference for where that would be on your sleeve block pattern here. And I will trace that with the center line so I can keep my grain line and original center in mind. That will still need to match up with my shoulder seam on my bodice later when I put this into a dress or use it on a top or whatever. I am just going to straighten off these sides as well. I've made this about 3 inches long. Of course, some of that will disappear into seam allowance. So in just a few minutes, you'll see me add on another inch to this because I thought maybe it was a little too short. But I will just straighten off the sides just to keep things simple, seeing as we're adding flare anyhow. I don't need this to narrow at all. We're actually going to be doing the opposite. So I'm going to come out from the center on either side, both the left and the right here, or the front and back of the sleeve. I'll just come out in 2-inch sections and separate each side into 4. For a smaller sleeve, you may want to use 1.5 or 1-inch sections. And for a larger sleeve, you may want to bump up to 3 inches. It just depends on the size of your sleeve pattern. But I think the Armstrong text recommends 2 inches, if I remember correctly. Splitting this into slimmer and more sections is only going to help you distribute that flare even more evenly across the amount of fullness we're about to add into this. And of course, I will need to cut that out. Do remember that for me, I do keep seam allowance on my pattern, so this pattern already has seam allowance inherent within it, which means I only need to add additional seam allowance when I cut the pattern apart, which I'm not going to be adding any style lines to this flutter sleeve today, but just something to keep in mind. If your patterns don't have seam allowance, don't forget to either add that on later or cut them out knowing that you need some. Hopefully that makes sense. And then I will slice up from the cuff to the sleeve cap like so. I'm going to slice along all of our indications we've added in here. That way I can add flare in here. And this may seem quite similar to the puff at the cuff sleeve that I showed you how to make in the initial sleeve modifications video, and that is because the only difference between this and that is a little bit of additional length that you add on for the puff sleeves, or should perhaps add on for the puff sleeves, and of course adding on a cuff to contain all of this. But you can go ahead and expand this to a full circle cut sleeve if you would like, although at that point it's probably easier to just create a circle with the circumference of your arm side measurement. So that would probably be easier to just draft with a compass and do it from scratch. You could also concentrate the flare just on the outer side of the arm. This is going to be the outermost portion of the arm below the shoulder, and conversely not add flare or fullness to the underarm area if you wanted to keep that slightly smoother and just keep the focus of flare on the outside shoulder tip. And of course, like so many design decisions, you don't have to do anything. You can do whatever you want. You may add a little or a lot of flutter to your sleeves at your own discretion. But again, the standard sort of flutter sleeve, I believe, is where you open this up to a half circle. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on a fresh sheet of paper. And I will go ahead and draw in both a horizontal line and a center line to be able to line my first sleeve up on top of this new sheet of paper here. And I will position my first sleeve, I guess, my sacrificial sleeve, as it were, right here along this line, and I'm going to position the center point of the sleeve cap along the center line where that meets the horizontal line I drew in as an indicator. Hopefully you see what I mean. Pin that in place, and then I will go ahead and tape the rest of this into place, opening up the underarm seam so that it sits parallel on top of that horizontal indicator line. Again, look at what I'm doing. It's hard to explain. If you're listening to this as a podcast, there's no way to know what's going on. You have to look at the screen to be able to see what's happening. And you can see that for my particular 2-inch sections. This is not actually completely distributing this evenly, so really I should probably separate my underarm area, at least where it gets really curvy, into 1-inch wide strips to really get this into a super nice curve, but I think in the end it doesn't make a huge difference in the finished sleeve. But if you're being picky, you might want to separate into more sections and really get a super nice curve along here. And you can see we have really distorted the sleeve cap here, but it's still going to fit down into the arm side. We haven't changed the actual measurement of the stitching line along the sleeve cap. We've just changed the shape of the sleeve. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to set this into my standard arm side later. I have not changed that measurement at all. And of course I can go ahead and cut this out, so I'll do that. And really you can peel that top layer off now that you've used it as an indicator once you cut this out, but I'm just going to tape it down into place, tape down my floops. And again, this is going to be about a 4-inch long flutter sleeve, so if you like the look of this, try 4 inches long. And I went ahead and cut that out of some spare green quilting cotton that I keep in the studio for mock-ups. That was clearly quite wrinkly, so I gave that a quick press. I just need to stitch these underarm seams. Now, this is a fully half-circle hem, so it's very curvy hem. You can either do a narrow hem on this, or you could do bias binding either along the edge itself with the binding showing, or turn towards the inside as a sort of bias hem. I do love a bias hem. Or of course you could fully line these as well. And especially with a contrast color, it might be quite fun, because these will flutter around, especially in the breeze. And it might be fun to have a different fabric on the inside. And I will just stitch these short little underarm seams over here on the Singer 99K. I even had it loaded with mint green thread because of something else I was sewing, so that was convenient. And then I can set one of these sleeves into my mock-up bodice for the day, my demonstration bodice, which I was making out of this same green color of quilting cotton. And again, quilting cotton, not the best weight of fabric for apparel. And the flutter sleeve and other actually flared sleeves in this video are all going to hang so differently depending on the textile you use. So it's not just the amount of flare you add in. Again, this is a half circle as opposed to a full circle cut. But not only the amount of flare you add, but also what textile you are using will determine the final look. So something crisper, a silk taffeta or a cotton poplin, is going to hold out the shape of the flare that you add in there. It's going to have a lot of body to it. Flare will be added onto the silhouette, whereas something heavier or something very floopy, like a chiffon, is going to drape much closer to the body and in tighter folds, so it's not going to hold out this flared shape that we've added in. The silhouette of a flutter sleeve really depends on the textile used, so it's definitely something to keep in mind when you are designing and planning a project. And I can just set my flutter sleeve into the arm side of my mock-up here. You can see I've even put a long red dress zipper into the back of this so that I can put it on by myself. Of course, pinning mock-ups up your back is not very fun or feasible often. It's hard enough to get a zipper up your back by yourself, let alone to pin a mock-up closed. So often I try and remember to do a center front opening on a mock-up, but I forgot for this particular. I had already cut it out and I was like, oh gosh, I'll just put a zipper in the back. So a sacrificial zipper. I could technically pick it out of this mock-up and use it, but I figure I don't use bright red very often anyhow. So that was the zipper I chose from the zipper drawer here in the studio. And again, the same 1/2-inch seam allowance that I use all the time here in my studio. I will go ahead and stitch this sleeve into place into the arm side of my mock-up. And here is what the flutter sleeve looks like on me. And again, like I said, this is holding its shape. It's sticking out away from my arm. It's holding that flare. Because this is a quilting cotton, it has more of a medium weight and a slight crispness to it as opposed to a chiffon, which would of course fall directly all the way to my arm underneath and not hold out the flared shape. This is about like mid-bust on me, about apex level, the length of this sleeve. I think this is probably the sweet spot for a flutter sleeve for me. I actually don't love a flutter sleeve usually, but this one could almost be confused for my all-in-one sleeve just because of the silhouette and again, this crisper fabric. And while this is not a style I would actually turn to in my own sewing very often, I actually liked it better than I thought I would. And my other arm here is modeling the bell sleeve, so let's go ahead and jump into that. And again, this house coat pattern is really helping me to show you what a gentle bell sleeve will look like. You often see these quite exaggerated, but this is much more of a sedate bell sleeve compared to what I and many go for when constructing a more fantasy-ish flared sleeve. And again, a bell sleeve was very common in the 1960s and 1970s as well. But speaking of larger versions, I did make these absolutely giant bell sleeves for this black and silver dress that you may have seen me construct here on the channel. I can put a card up to this video if you'd like to see how I made this exact version of these bell sleeves with the split up the outside. And these are absolutely gargantuan and make me feel like I'm wearing a cape. I love them. They're super witchy and fun, which again is what we're usually going for with bell sleeves, I know, but I will show you a more sedate version in our demonstration today. So again, I must trace a copy of my basic block sleeve. So I will square off a line to do that with, line up the center of my sleeve, and trace a full copy of that. like so. I am going to square off the sides of this because, again, I will be flaring this, so I'm just marking the length and then I'll just use it as a rectangle. Because once again, I'm going to be separating this 2 inches out from either side of the center line, and then 2 inches out again, and adding flare in. It's almost like it's the exact same process, but just on a longer sleeve. Like I said, all Flutter sleeves are kind of bell sleeves, but not all bell sleeves are Flutter sleeves. At some point, instead of Flutter, it becomes flounce, or floosh, which is like swoosh and flounce at the same time. Anyhow, I will cut this out, and again, I will need to cut up my indicator lines to the sleeve cap, all the way from down here at the hem. You can see I've eliminated the elbow dart. I just didn't even trace it in because I squared off that side entirely. We don't need to fit the sleeve closer to the arm because instead we're going to be flaring it from the cap all the way to the cuff. And once again, you can open this up as much as you want, add in a ton of fullness if you wish. You could open this up all the way to a circle cut sleeve. Again, probably easier to draw that just drawing the circles and keeping the math in mind. Or into a half circle like I did with the Flutter sleeve, but usually that's going to mean you need to add a seam somewhere because this is no longer going to fit on most fabrics unless they are very wide, and it would eat up a ton of fabric. I'm not saying it wouldn't be worth it, I'm just saying it would be a lot of yardage. I'm just going to go ahead and add in about 3 inches between each of these splits that I've cut up the side of the sleeve here. Again, I didn't add a ton to the underarm on this. You can see the last 4 inches on either side are still their smooth area. You could add a little bit of flare there too if you wanted. Again, it all depends on what you are after. The general idea here is add flare. Just like you would with an A-line skirt. You can make an A-line skirt just using your dart fullness for your skirt, or you can add in more. I covered that in that video. Hopefully, you know what I mean. Go back, watch all volumes of Drafting Dangerous, help a girl out, and you will hopefully learn something as well. But I've just eyeballed this. I didn't even measure, and I've taped that down, and I will have to tape down so many floops, both on this side and the other side. Oh well. Again, I want to keep in mind my center line here so I can cut this on grain. Again, my sleeve cap has not changed. It will still fit into my arm side, and we can get an idea of what this sleeve is going to look like on the body, even here in the paper. Especially because this is going to be a sticky, annoying sleeve. Don't cut this style of sleeve out in quilting cotton. It's simply... Quilting cotton sticks to itself. It's like... it's not Velcro, but it feels almost like Velcro in the sense that it doesn't... Like, you know how when you have a smooth lining fabric, it slides against itself? That's the opposite of quilting cotton. Quilting cotton sticks to itself. So this doesn't drape very nicely in the mock-up. I apologize for that. But of course I wasn't going to waste any nice silk on a mock-up. So you will simply have to bear with me. And I will again sew my underarm seam and press that open. Again, you can finish this curved hem in any which way you see fit. You don't have to have a straight across hem also. You can of course make something like this have a more asymmetric hem where you make it longer along the underarm seam and have it be a little bit shorter over your wrist itself. But here is this flared longer sleeve. Again, not really working well for me in the quilting cotton, but in general, a very fine sleeve. And I do use a subtle bell sleeve quite often. I usually just add a little bit of fullness to a standard sleeve just to give a slightly more fantasy look to a jacket. And of course, I have used split bell sleeves quite a lot here on the channel, including for my Space Queen dress from several years ago. For those of you who have been around this long, thank you for watching. Sticking with me as I go through many transitions and my productivity slows so much, which is very unfortunate. Maybe one day I'll get back to my peak, but it doesn't seem likely. I keep trying. And then another variation of a subtle bell sleeve can be to just close the elbow dart and use that fullness at the cuff. And here I have lengthened that as well because I'm going to leave it split open for my hand to stick out. So this is almost more of an elbow length sleeve with a drape behind it. And I used this for the brocade evening gown that I wore in Arcana. I also puffed the shoulder cap of this, but it's still sort of using the principle of added flare to create a slightly bell shape for the end of my sleeve. But I know, just like me, you don't want to be sedate. You want to be positively medieval, or macabre, as it were. Especially if you're anything like me and used to flip through the counter books of the costume patterns for McCall's and Butterick and Simplicity back in the day in, like, say, 2003 or 4, when there was plenty of witchy deliciousness to be found. And while I often see this particular style of sleeve called a bell sleeve as well, and it technically is, I would actually call this a trumpet sleeve instead, because while the bottom half of the sleeve is flared, the top portion from the elbow up to the sleeve cap is actually kept quite slim compared to the bell sleeve we were just drafting a moment ago. So all of the flare is being added into the bottom half of the sleeve here, and in my case for this particular one I'll draft for you right now, from the underarm seam. I'm just dipping this sleeve down along the underarm seam, and it'll look very strange here in the paper pattern piece. But stick with me and I'll show you what it looks like in fabric. And again, I have traced a copy of my basic block sleeve. And I have squared off a line parallel to the center from the end of the elbow dart to the cuff, and I will cut up that line and close my elbow dart as a way to begin flaring the bottom half of the sleeve. Again, this is often the only amount of flare I will use to just slightly flare a jacket sleeve or a coat sleeve. I think it adds a tiny bit of extra fun to a jacket or blazer sleeve. And that was what I did for this Dupioni silk jacket you've seen here on the channel. I can link to this video as well if you'd like to see me make this entire jacket, but you can see this sleeve is slightly pointed and also slightly flared. A very subtle trumpet sleeve, as it were, whereas this is about to get rather exaggerated, hence the name at the top of the screen. If that's a trumpet sleeve, this is about to be a French horn. In fact, I'm going to need more paper, so let me just cut off another piece from my roll of alphanumeric here. And I'm going to really exaggerate the shape of this from, again, about elbow level to the hem. So I'm going to go ahead and measure from elbow level to the original cuff of my sleeve. It's about, I think it was 12 inches or so. And I will come out and actually just curve that off at the elbow level. And then I decided, what if I dip this down a little bit longer along the underarms too? So I actually added on a tiny bit here before I started cutting that out. Like so. As you can see, I haven't added on a full 90 degrees here, but maybe around 75 degrees of fullness to the back of the sleeve. You can go ahead and do a straight 90 degrees, although you might want to wait for the next sleeve style because it might be easier to do it that way. But I would say with drafting, if you're willing to sew it, go for it. Sometimes you can introduce more complexity than you'll want to deal with in the next step, so that's just something to be cautious of. But I'll cut this first side out here, which is actually the front side of my sleeve. I try and label things F and B so I don't get turned around on my sleeves. And then I will tape more paper onto the other side, and it still won't be enough paper because, again, I'm flaring this quite a lot. I will fold this along the center line, and I will just trace this along the other side here, and again, add in more paper because I still don't have enough. But at the cuff itself, I've added in about 2 inches of extra hem length at the underarm seam here. And of course, this underarm seam now looks wonkadoodle as all get out, but easy enough to sew. Put a couple of clips in that curve, no problem. And I will, of course, have to tape down my floops. And now that I have this giant mola shaped pattern piece, I can cut that out of mock-up fabric and show you what this looks like on my body. And of course, Oliver is here to supervise. All right, here is that same sleeve in muslin attached to our mock-up here. And yes, this is extremely fun. This is an extremely fun sleeve. I would love to use this on just like a regular 1940s or 50s dress. And then again, have this rather, I don't know, fantasy medieval sleeve going on here. And of course, this is good for more Stevie Nicks or bohemian styles or more witchy styles in general as well. An exaggerated trumpet sleeve. Very fun indeed. And this doesn't even look too bad here in the cotton muslin, but it would look even more ethereal, of course, in something with a bit better drape to it, or something sheer. A rayon satin, a silk velvet perhaps, something a little bit more luxurious or a little bit floopier. Yes, a floopy is a noun, but floopy is an adjective. Keep up. And then lastly for today, I will talk about the two-piece trumpet sleeve, or the circle cut flounce sleeve, because I will cut a full circle for the bottom half of this sleeve. And this is where you add a seam into the equation. For the last sleeve we were working on, I did just have that underarm seam not fully right angled, like I said, but the pattern piece did look strange by the time I was done. This time I'm going to measure my underarm. It's about 8.5 inches, which lands me to about the center of my elbow dart. Who could have guessed that one? So I'll just mark this as an 8.5 inch long version of my sleeve. Again, tracing the standard sleeve block for this. And this will serve as the top portion of my circle cut flounce trumpet sleeve. We've added too many modifiers onto the sleeve at this point. Again, you'll see things like this just called a bell sleeve, so these are all sort of bell sleeves. But hopefully you've begun to understand the variety encompassed within the bell family of sleeve types. And this will be the top of my sleeve. Of course, I've added on seam allowance for that as well, because I need to stitch on the bottom flounce. In this case, I'm going to cut a full circle. You could, of course, do a half circle, or you could gather fabric instead of doing a circle. You could do a large or like long rectangle and just gather fabric down to have a gathered flounce. You, of course, could layer any of these things. So if you wanted to do more than one layer of flounce, you could have many layers. So things look more like almost ruffles, like a ruffled flounce. And to draw this circle, I just need the interior, the small circle here. I need this to match the bottom of my sleeve, of course. This is about 15 inches, so minus 1 inch for seam allowance. I need a 14-inch circumference circle for this little circle here. Of course, I have my paper folded, so I need half that. This is where we get into circle skirt math. Pull out the circle calculator unless you want to actually do your math yourself. I needed a 2.2 radius circle, but I don't know what you need. And again, I need to add on about 12 inches for the length of my circle cut flounce here. Again, you could make it super extra long if you wanted to. There was a lot of exaggerated circle cut flounce sleeves in like glam rock outfits of the 1970s and into the 80s. So if you want to go full glam, go for it. Again, on a house coat with like Marlboro feather trim on it would be quite fun. Or in a burnout velvet or something. Go full Florence the Machine, why not? And indeed, I did have to cut the bottom half of my sleeve out of muslin once again because I was out of green fabric. But you just stitch the circle on to the elbow of the sleeve itself, and here's my full circle cut sleeve, and again, a mid-weight cotton. Probably not exactly the sort of fabric I would make this out of in the end, but still fun nonetheless. This has a lot of swish to it. And if you move this seam up to about mid-bicep, these start to look like a lot of sleeves used in Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, so this becomes a fantasy elven sleeve very easily. You can go from mid-century glamour house coat to glam rock to elven really quickly using this modification. And again, your second half of your sleeve doesn't have to be a circle. Here I've sewn on very long rectangles and left the top of them split open. Again, this is another gown that I made here on the channel, so if you'd like to see this, I can link to it below, or perhaps in a card if I have one left. I hope you found these demonstrations helpful today, and let me know what other sorts of styles you would like to see me continue to demonstrate here on Drafting Dangerous. And coming up, we do have the long-promised curved darts and a princess seam video, style line video, and then eventually we will get to trousers. No, I haven't been putting it off. I don't know what you're talking about. Anyhow, thank you as always for watching today, and a huge thank you to my patrons who make all of my work and these videos possible. And as always, I'll be back here drafting dangerously with you again real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!